Today, we're going to have a look at one of the essays that I wrote the day before sitting the GAMSAT. Before we start, a couple of things I want to mention is firstly, to get the most out of this video, it's a good idea to make sure you pause the section and read through the actual paragraph itself before looking at the key findings that I will list on the page itself. Pay attention to what you might consider in the certain features of the paragraph itself, certain strengths or weaknesses that you might have identified. So pause the video at sections throughout and see if you can identify and compare what you have thought to be strengths and weaknesses to what I have thought to be strengths and weaknesses. Okay. Now, one last thing, and I suppose it's a caveat of some sorts. I've only said this as an 80 plus essay because, well, firstly, I wouldn't say that the essay is necessarily 80 plus, but it is written by someone who has achieved an 80 plus. So it was written on the day before I sat the GAMSAT, and in that sitting, I was lucky enough to get an 81 in section 2. So whilst it's not the same essay that I wrote in the actual sitting itself, it has, I suppose, it was written by someone with the same skills and expertise at the time of achieving an 81. So I just want to make that caveat because today we always see these different kinds of essays all over the internet saying this particular essay is of this particular score. But in reality, we have no guarantee, and their word is as good as anyone else's because they don't have access to ACE's marking criteria. So you have to be very careful and aware of certain claims that are being made when a particular essay is supposedly of a particular score. Always make sure and think about, well, was this written to time conditions? Does it seem feasible at all in exam situations, etc.? Okay, let's begin. In terms of the analysis approach, pay attention to the two important things, specifically structure and content. Use these questions to help you identify certain features in the paragraph, and these will be essentially how the key findings will be outlined in terms of structure and content. Now, this is the quote itself. I'm not going to go through I'm actually not going to go through it at all, but quote interpretation is covered elsewhere if you're interested. The introduction. So I would like you to pause the video now, read through the introduction, and make a list of particular strengths or weaknesses that you have identified. Okay, hopefully you've done that because now we're going to have a look at the key findings. We're going to have a look at the key findings and then come back to the paragraph and I'll explain what they are. So once again, structure and content, and we'll start with structure. So I'm going to see if I can annotate this. All right, let's have a look at the first idea, which is essentially here. This is this sentence here. What is this particular sentence? Well, the sentence here is actually a defining statement because it's actually saying democratic process is whatever this is. Okay, so it's not really there to necessarily convey a contention just yet, but it's saying, okay, it's conveying to the reader that, all right, I understand. This is how I'm defining and how I'm understanding democracy. But then the next sentence, what is the next sentence? Despite this, it emphasizes the importance of a fair and judicious process in determining so. It is, however, an ineffective and inefficient process. Let me just make that a bit neater. When judged in terms of its capacity to effect positive societal change. Now, I want to point out that this is actually the contention. And this is the contention because the first part is only defining what democratic processes are. But this is actually the contention because it's providing a particular viewpoint regarding the previous point. Now, the structure here talks about, in terms of the strengths, signposting forthcoming arguments. Now, let's have a look at what I mean by this. Because in the next sentence here, what we have here is essentially the first body paragraph. By nature of permitting the contributions from all adults capable of minimum level of cognition, the democratic process naturally invites skepticism and uninformed decision-making, especially matters of complex societal and political nature. So this is actually the first argument. Why is this the first argument? Well, you see here, the contention is a broad overarching statement of your position. And I highlighted this part here, ineffective and inefficient process, because if we look at the next sentence, we can say, well, why or how is it ineffective and inefficient? Well, it naturally invites skepticism and uninformed decision-making, especially in matters of complex social and political nature. So that's really a form of ineffectiveness and inefficiency. So we can see here, at a hierarchy perspective, this first sentence here is a body paragraph argument because it sits ideologically beneath this idea of an ineffective and inefficient process. Now you see the next part here is the next body paragraph signposted in the introduction. Furthermore, as the direction of society becomes dependent on the will of voters, there is a possibility for the tyranny of the majority to emerge. Okay. Now, the key thing that I want you to pay attention to here is that it is completely moving in a different direction to the first sentence here. And that's how we know that this is another body paragraph that's being signposted. And once again, let's look at the third one. Consequently, societal process cannot occur at a reliable pace, particularly when it's popular culture or opinion that dictates the interest of the whole. Yet for the second individual rights, this is perhaps a shortcoming we all must accept. Same thing here. A very distinct argument that isn't a repetition of the previous two ideas, right? First one talks about skepticism, uninformed decision making. Second one talks about the tyranny of the majority to emerge as one of the forms of an ineffective and inefficient process. And lastly, we're talking about here a lack of societal progress because popular culture or opinion that dictates the interest of the whole. Okay? So three distinct ideas. Firstly, skepticism, uninformed decision making. Secondly, tyranny of the majority. Thirdly, a lack of societal progress. So those three distinct points are signposted forthcoming arguments, and they're distinct. There is no overlap, very little overlap. In terms of the other points regarding structure, there is no obvious grammatical or structural errors. There is a clear overarching thesis and contention with supporting arguments, like what we've said before. And I guess the thing here is it'd be very important to try and consider it as such. We have a contention here, and then the contention is broad and overarching. So really, contention, and then we have the contention encompassing the ideas, essentially. So if I could just represent that here. As such, all right? And we have that here. We have that logical arrangement where the topic sentence, the contention here regarding the ineffective and inefficient process is sitting here. And then underneath it, we have specific forms of ineffectiveness and inefficiency as highlighted here. So that's the structural strength of this introduction. Now, in terms of content, one of the strengths is, of course, the clear definition of the key theme. Always in the first sentence, try to provide your own definition of the key idea to show that you've engaged with, what are the prompts and your understanding, and show your understanding of what the actual keywords mean. And the other thing here is in this contention here, if I might use a different color, this contention here, from here to here, this is a contention that extends beyond simple agreement and disagreement. What do I mean by this? If we go back to the topics, okay, that is terrible. If you look at this part here, the democratic process is the greatest of all human creations. Simple agreement would just be yes, completely agree. Simple disagreement would be no, completely disagree. Now, the whole point of what this contention is saying is that although it is fair and judicious, it is ineffective and inefficient. Can you see how that's less one-dimensional? It's saying it has its benefits. However, there are issues with inefficiency and ineffectiveness. So it's not just sort of saying, yes, it is the greatest invention, or no, it isn't. But it is in fact saying that, okay, it is good in this regard, but however, suffers from the rest of this particular idea. So that's what I mean by contention that extends beyond simple agreement and disagreement. This is very, very important in terms of how you start to explore more complex ideas. And why do we need to do this? We do this because we want to show insight and nuance into our understanding of the world. Because in medicine and also in real life, things are rarely black and white. It's not simple yes or no. So you want to reflect that in your essay and show you understand the complexity of real world processes and experiences. Okay, so that's why we want to have this here. Furthermore, if you're only having simple agreement, you're not giving yourself the best platform to launch into complex discussions. Next, the other strength here is what we call a logical concession. What do I mean by this? It's conceding something, right? We're sort of saying, we're acknowledging that, okay, we still need to have this, however. And I think the logical concession is in fact here. It's saying that, okay, although we have all these issues, it is, however, still a very important political approach towards determining solutions in the world. Okay? And that, once again, demonstrates that nuance of things not just being all correct or all incorrect, right? Still need to have that perspective and insight to demonstrate that we see the world not just in simple terms. And of course, the last point about the content is direct relevancy to the provided stimuli. This is very much within the realms of what these topics are. And I apologize that the annotation carries across like this, especially the first point here, which is really what I was writing towards. Okay. In terms of its weaknesses, there's a couple of things. Let me just get rid of all of this. The main weakness is that it's factually incorrect. And it's incorrect in the way of here. This is just purely incorrect. Anybody, even if they are intellectually disabled, they are permitted political participation. So I don't know what I was thinking about then, but that's entirely incorrect. And there's also some wordiness as well. There's definitely parts where you can sacrifice a couple of words and you wouldn't necessarily change the key message as well. So, for example, here, whilst it emphasizes the importance of a fair and judicious process, we can just get rid of this. You just say, whilst it emphasizes a fair and judicious process. So, really, importance doesn't give that much value here. All right. And then here, yet for the sake of individual rights, this is perhaps a shortcoming we must all accept. What we can actually say here is that, yeah, this is necessary. This is a necessary shortcoming for the preservation of individual rights. And that gives it a lot more explanation and cuts down a couple of words as well. All right. Let's clear this and move to the next one. So this is what we went through just before. Okay. Same thing as before. Pause now before I start to go into the findings. So a couple of things here, but when we go back to it, we can see that firstly, let's focus on the first sentence. Okay. There's this idea of a linear progression of explanation and reasoning, and I'll explain what that is. If we look through each of the sentences, you'll notice something. Every sentence adds on more ideas in terms of not repeating itself, but also providing a further layer of detail. So in this particular sentence, the very first topic sentence, what is it doing? It's defining what democracy is about. And then in the next one, it does say, well, okay, it's now adding on this idea that, okay, it attenuates the power of technical expertise. All right. So it's kind of saying it's a consequence of what the first sentence is describing. What's happening in the next one? It matters that are more complex, such as, so we're now talking about examples. We're adding even more detail and then saying, because of such overpowering of technical expertise, there is the possibility of the layperson to misjudge or misapprehend the nuances of such matters. And then what's the next sentence? And as long as popular opinion outnumbers, what we have then is this tendency to be to have this resolution by most popular solution, regardless of efficacy or moral integrity. And then once again, as we continue on this chain of logic, we see this idea that, well, what's the outcome of resolving things in the most popular way? Well, it might be more difficult to implement conscientious and multifaceted solutions. And then what happens then? Right? We then may very well hinder or adversely influence the preservation and maintenance of public welfare. So you can see here what's happening. Every sentence describes a further consequence and outcome of the previous. That's what I mean by linear progression of explanation, because every sentence is connected to one another. And that's how you get this straight line of progression in logic that advances beyond just the topic sentence and does not repeat itself. And as you can see, as we take that journey throughout the paragraph, all of the sentences none of the sentences deviate from the signposted idea, which is talking about this idea of the effects of having a democratic electoral process. And the other thing that I want to mention is this idea of consistency with the introduction. So this first body paragraph is talking about, okay, as a whole, because the people determine the outcomes, there is this weakness because they are overriding technical expertise. And as such, solutions are determined by what's most popular. So if we go back, doesn't this kind of link with what we have here? By permitting the contribution by all adults capable, democratic process naturally invites skepticism and uninformed decision-making. So this part here, skepticism and uninformed decision-making, right? That correlates to what we have here, this idea of layperson misjudging or misapprehending the nuances of such matter. So there is consistency with the introduction. So I've signposted body paragraph 1 and I've actually explained it in a lot more detail. And that's what we want in the introduction and the body paragraphs. Consistency in structure. Now, the only weakness here in terms of the structure is this idea that the key message is not signposted in that first sentence. And you'll notice that here, in this one here, as part of the democratic electoral process, this doesn't actually mention anything to do with overpowering technical expertise. It actually only comes in the second sentence. So that's the key weakness. We really want to have the key message in the topic sentence. All right. So really to solve this, we would shorten the first one and combine it with the second sentence. Now, in terms of the content, we talked about this a little bit already. There is in-depth exploration of feasibility of the key message. In terms of saying, okay, we've introduced this potential idea of overpowering technical expertise and misjudging and misapprehending the nuances of an issue. How does that actually occur? Well, we've explained this in all of the sentences. So the whole strength about the content here is that, like I said before, it goes beyond just saying that there is this issue here. It explains, well, how does that issue arise? What are the outcomes of it? Okay. The other thing that I want to also mention here is there is a couple of examples, not just a single example. We have here treatment of refugees, use of experimental medicine, or public health policies. The benefit of having multiple examples is that it shows that you understand this topic at a broader level. And that's important because if you're only having one example, that might weaken, we might not necessarily weaken your argument, but it's not as strong as identifying a common theme across multiple contexts in real life. And that just goes to emphasize your idea even more. And if you think about it like this, these are examples that aren't necessarily specific or historical. They're everyday examples that you and I can think of if we thought a bit harder about things. So you can have a list of examples as probably one of the best ways to go about providing evidence, as opposed to forcing yourself to remember historical examples or very specific situations that's happened in real life. And of course, appropriate word choice. There is not any, there's no word here that necessarily is, unnecessary in the way that it's overly complex, overly flamboyant. The vocabulary is strong. And of course, it links back to the overall contention and thesis in the very last point here about the fact that it might be a necessary sacrifice, which is what we talked about in the introduction. Now, in terms of the weaknesses, there's a couple of things here. Firstly, once again, it's factually incorrect. So I don't really know what I was doing, but the thing that is incorrect here is this part here. People who are disabled or who have suffered misfortune are still allowed to have political participation. As simple as that. The next thing is this one here. Libertarian. That's actually the wrong definition. It should be egalitarian. And I'll leave it up to you to find out what the difference is. And the other thing here, in terms of the other thing here for content is this idea here, for the sake of human rights and liberties, such shortcomings are perhaps a necessary risk or sacrifice society must embrace. Really, that could be a bit better written in the way of saying, despite this, human rights and liberties must be preserved because of X, Y, and Z, right? Because it's saying for the sake of human rights and liberties. So the opportunity to expand here is to offer something a bit more in terms of, well, what's so important about human rights? Why do we care about it so much? And why is that something, why would that make it a necessary sacrifice? Okay, let's move on. The second body paragraph, we have the same thing here. Hopefully you've had time to read the body paragraph because now we have the key findings. We talked about linear progression logic before, so I'm not going to go into it a bit more, except just to add that what I mean by linear progression is that it's unilateral. It branches off in no particular directions, but just one. It continues the idea introduced in the first or second sentences and advances it in a unilateral fashion. Similar strengths in terms of the structure, but a bit more towards the content that I'm going to focus on. I'm not going to talk a bit more about the linear progression of logic. It's something that we've talked about a little bit more already in the first body paragraph. And once again, there's consistency with the introduction, because if we look at what this is, what the key message in the second body paragraph is about, we know that it's very similar, or in fact, it matches with what's being said here, which is the second signposting statement in the introduction about the tyranny of the majority. Okay. And this is, of course, related to marginalizing minority groups and furthering inequalities and inequities. And once again, all throughout the body paragraph, there's no deviation from the signposted idea. Every sentence is to do with explaining how this is a possibility, how this is a possibility and what the outcomes are related to. And once again, we have the advantage of using multiple examples to once again demonstrate that our ideas make sense across different contexts and are therefore more broadly applicable and relevant. And the other thing that I want to mention is there's also another logical concession. And if you can identify it, good. Otherwise, it is here. Whilst not all political actions have been dictated by popular opinion, this is a logical concession because it's conceding that not all political actions are, of course, determined by popular opinion. There are other political things that happen outside of what popular opinion dictates. So that's acknowledging that. And once again, why do we do this? We're trying to do this because we want to demonstrate to the reader that, like I said before earlier, we see the world in more than just black and white. We have nuance, we have perspective into the way the world works because that's necessary. This is real life. You want to, of course, capture your perspective and insight within the essay. And so logical concessions in these small throwaway dependent clauses within a sentence are helpful in this particular way because it shows nuance, it shows perspective and insight. Okay, so that's where the logical concession sits. And once again, appropriate word choice. The language isn't necessarily complex or flamboyant. It is really the idea that carries the ideas and the quality across. Okay, so if you had a preference between language and idea, always pick ideas first. That's why I always encourage my students to make sure you try and express your ideas with as simple language as you can before you try and build up your vocabulary. Now then, the weaknesses. So there's a couple of weaknesses actually. There's excessive wordiness throughout the sentence, the first sentence, and throughout the rest of the paragraph. Now the difference between wordiness and word choice is, well, the word choice being what particular word. Now the wordiness is how you've put the words together in the sentence to make things clear. And I'll show you. Get rid of all this. So, in terms of wordiness, what I mean by this is the words themselves, there's no issues, but there are too many of them. Additionally, problems associated with the rule of the majority. So we just say, additionally, the rule of the majority, get rid of that. Oh, it's definitely a better way I could have done that. Problems associated, so here. Additionally, the rule of the majority marginalizes minority groups and furthers the inequities and inequalities perpetuated by popular culture. So all of these words here, this here and this here, are necessary because, it's got, doesn't really add any value. This hasn't really changed the sentence in a very significant way. And that's a really good way you can use, you can do to see if you have any superfluous words. Eliminate them, see if it's made a significant change to the sentence. If it hasn't, it isn't necessary at all. It isn't necessary to have. And some of the other options or some of the other ways that we can improve the wordiness in this section is here. Modern society represents a homogeneous set of values. And then here as well, asserts themselves, quite unnecessary. Sounds great. I know, I like it a lot, but we can just say the masses are a potential opponent. That's good enough. Something I forgot to also mention is this idea of logical accommodation and nuance. So what do I mean by this? The point about this here, political inaction or untimely intervention, this is what I call logical accommodation. It is called logical accommodation because if we think about the outcome that's being discussed here, often those who require the most who lose out. So they're losing out on something. And what are they losing out on? We've said here, political inaction or untimely intervention. Why did I pick these two? I picked these two because they are the most reasonable, most likely, and most relevant outcome. If you think about the entire subset of all potential outcomes related to this idea about those who who require the most assistance, but they'll lose out on it, there is a potential outcome such as perhaps they do get timely intervention and they get a lot of funding. However, a corrupt politician embezzles all the money. That's another outcome, but it is less likely and less relevant compared to political inaction or untimely intervention, because those two, in my view, are the most immediate and most relevant outcomes to include. So I've written them here to accommodate for this, because there's no way you can list out every single outcome related to your idea. It is just unfeasible and a waste of your time. So you accommodate for this particular issue by including 2 or 3 of the most reasonable, most likely, most relevant options from the list of outcomes that you can possibly conceive and include them. And that's what I mean by logical accommodation. You're accommodating for this possibility of all of these particular outcomes, but it's good enough to include, say, the most relevant, most likely. So you've covered probably 80 to 90% of your bases, if that makes sense. Now, going back to this issue about the inadequate explanation and follow-up, we talked a little bit about linear progression of logic. Now, the difference between that is the linear progression of logic describes the form and the structure of each sentence, and that is unilateral and advances towards one endpoint. However, the inadequate explanation and follow-up refers to here the fact that I might not have proven necessarily the outcomes that I want to talk about. So what do I mean by this? We're saying that the rule of majority causes marginalization and inequities and inequalities. Now then, I'll ask you this. Do we actually prove this to a reasonable extent? So if you look at the next sentence, it's talking about this idea of contrarian or deviant to norms invites criticism, contempt, and ignorance. However, the next 2 sentences are occupied by the example. And then starting from this sentence, coming back to the logic, we have this idea that they become an opponent towards unconventional ideas. And then we have this idea that they lose out on political inaction or untimely intervention. So the question is, did we talk about how it results into marginalization and inequities and inequalities? I would say not quite. There is a possible mechanism of how inequities and inequalities might be produced, but there is no clear linkage. So really what we need here is probably another sentence here. It's my very poor attempt of an arrow. Oh, that is terrible. Let me try that again. Here. Describing this idea that, as such, due to political inaction or untimely intervention, people's needs are being neglected, whereas those in the majority, they are likely to curry government favor and attention, thereby widening the disparity and inequity between the masses and minority groups. So really, we need one more sentence to round off the logic. And that's what I mean by inadequate explanation of follow-up on the key message, because we were almost there. We had this idea that the masses really could produce something that could produce negative outcomes to minorities through this idea of sociological behaviors related to contempt, criticism, and ignorance for anything that's contrarian. But then how does that produce inequities and inequalities? Well, then we need to make sure we describe and close the logical loop and circuit to say that, okay, there's going to be political inaction, and from political inaction, there's going to be these outcomes of differences. Now, the next weakness I want to describe is this idea of oversimplification of complex theme. Hopefully, you've identified it. If not, we can talk about it here. Modern society can be considered to represent a homogeneous set of values, attitudes, perspectives, and modes of existence. The biggest issue really is this word here, homogeneous. It's carrying a bit too much. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting in the wrong way, because, Australian modern society is not homogeneous, or any society is not the most homogeneous, really. I guess what I meant to say is that this should be heterogeneous instead of homogeneous. So that's really an oversimplification by including that word here. And then because of what we had in terms of not elaborating and connecting to this key point, we have this other weakness of inadequate linkage to the overall contention. So you think about it like this. Minority groups have lost out against the overshadowing and overpowering nature of the masses. But then how does that relate to the democratic process? Okay, so you need to kind of link that in and say, this is a possible outcome related to democratic ideals because political action is determined by what's most popular. So you see how that, once again, rounds out the logic. And now coming to the third body paragraph, we have some of the similar strengths here. Not going to go over too much about what we're talking about in terms of the structure here. We've talked about this quite a lot already. So jumping straight into the content, clear link to the overall contention and thesis. So here we're talking about overall this issue about societal progress. And we can see with all of this particular, the entirety of the body paragraph is related to the way of societal progress and whether or not it is possible when you have this change in governing bodies. And we know that this is not, there are issues with this. And this is related to the overall contention and thesis, because if you go back all the way into the introduction, we can see that this idea of progress has been related to this ineffective and inefficient process, right? So talking about here, consequently, societal progress cannot occur at a reliable pace, so making it inefficient and ineffective. And that's what we've talked about entirely in the third body paragraph. So we have this consistency, once again, and a clear link to the overall contention and thesis. Now, the other strength in the content is this idea of relevant soft examples. What do we mean by this? So this is essentially a way of making yourself, I suppose, ensuring yourself against mistakes. So we have soft examples here, and we're talking about a party that prioritizes social welfare versus one that prioritizes economic progress. So can you see how social welfare is actually a broad category, same as economic progress? Because we can actually go one step further and say, well, social welfare could also be, subsidized medicines, and income support for the unemployed. Economic progress can talk about, economic progress can actually be further categorized into things like, small businesses, industry progress, etc. So these are categories. Now, what is so good about these is the idea that you can play it a bit more safe and talk about things conceptually and broadly, because the next part about it, there is significant possibility to witness a reallocation of critical resources away from social benefits and support and towards infrastructure industry growth. So like I said before, talking about it broadly and conceptually makes it so that you don't necessarily have to think about a very concrete example. The other benefit to this is that categories are close enough to an example that they still fulfill that example without having you to go one step further and getting into the nitty-gritty of very, very specific examples like what we talked about there. So the main advantage is that it allows you to introduce an example, but still remain conceptual enough to engage with it, to the point that you don't need specialist technical knowledge of what goes on within these kind of things. Now, the next strength in terms of the content relating to elaborating and establishing feasibility of key messages comes from the development in the body here, where we're really talking about a very specific mechanistic description of, well, how do we actually get this outcome where societal progress is delayed? And we describe it in very strong detail here, where we're talking about how different political bodies across different elections obviously have different priorities. And because of such priorities, we have the outcome of changing the resource allocation and the efforts of the society at large. And so this is one of the strengths, because it gets into that particular mechanism, and people can really understand in a very simplistic way, sure, but mechanistically sound way of understanding why that is the case, where you have these shifts in values and ideals, because obviously different parties have different interests. Of course, then coming to the weaknesses related to the content, the main issue that we have is excessive wordiness and lack of substance. What do I mean by this? So we're talking about societal progress, sure, but this part here is unnecessary. It is quite clear that we can just say a democratic form of government offers neither the most productive nor effective platform for growth and development. That's it. We don't need to have that. It is quite clear. And then the next part here, it can be difficult for a nation to reliably focus on economic, political, or social growth. So we can say in multi-party systems, a nation faces difficulties in reliably focusing on economic, political, or social growths. So cutting a few extra words here. Next, shifts in power naturally indicate a shift. So a bit of repetition here. So we could say shifts in power are associated with changes in values and ideals, as different political bodies represent different set of priorities. So this is probably unnecessary here, we can just say the reallocation of resources across different sectors invariably suppresses society's maximal potential for development. Okay. Lastly, there's this idea of further elaboration of key themes being possible. So this is referring to this part here. Suppresses society's maximal potential for development. This is the main troublesome word here, maximal potential for development. So we're talking about societal progress, but maximal potential is a little bit different. Progress is the progress itself, but potential talks about a potential capacity, something that is not yet achieved. So because we've said that, that means that there is something else that we need to also describe in terms of, well, what do we mean by the maximal potential, right? What is the maximal potential? What constitutes maximal potential? So that's really the main point where we're talking about further elaboration of key themes are possible. And I guess the thing to caution you about is when you're getting towards the end of a body paragraph, be careful not to necessarily introduce new ideas or broad concepts that you might have to invariably describe further on. That being said, it's not necessarily a huge disadvantage or downside of this body paragraph. Let's continue. Now, the conclusion. We're almost there. These are the key findings of the conclusion. And I think the main point here is that the conclusion itself is perhaps the easiest thing to write because remember, in the conclusion, we are not looking to introduce any new ideas. All we're doing is summarizing. And so when we're summarizing, it should be the easiest because we've already said what we needed to say before. There is really no new ideas that need to be added in. So you see, this is why I think it's the easiest because you've already written what you needed to write. So all you need to do is just rephrase all of those key ideas once again. And we can see here that each of the sentences here represents something that we've talked about before. Respects the rights and freedom of all individuals in determining self-governance. This sentence here, reflects the very, very first defining sentence that we talked about, which is our defining statement about what we think democratic processes are about. The next part here, however, by permitting the political parties of the average student potential for less. So this is, I probably would say this is a little bit strange wording. I didn't really include it in the weaknesses, but something that I've now just picked up. And perhaps ignorance aside, the outcome of that is associative, complex, social, and moral dimensions. So remember, this is talking about the uninformed decision-making and misapprehending, misjudging complex social matters that we've said in the first body paragraph. So we have body paragraph 1 being represented by that sense. And before I embarrass myself any further, I'm going to type that instead. So body paragraph 1. Furthermore, the opinion of the mass also presents itself as a formidable opponent against political intentions that are discordant with popular culture, even if such actions seek to benefit the vulnerable. Doesn't that sound like the tyranny of the majority that we talked about in body paragraph 2? So that's represented here. Next, in both ways, by nature of the democratic process, the capacity to achieve and maximize societal progress is suppressed and dampened as frequent changes in power and priorities are an inevitability within democracy. That's literally what we just talked about there. Changes in political power, in political parties, causing differences in the interests and the priorities of society. Therefore, although democracy extols the values of humanity and freedom, it willingly sacrifices aspects of efficacy and efficiency within issues of political controversy and societal progress. So this is, once again, remember, we talked about this in the contention at the very, very start, right? If I'll go back here, we talked about ineffective and inefficient process as part of our contention, overarching contention. And that's mirrored here in the conclusion, efficiency and efficacy. So really, the conclusion should really be the easiest thing because you're just summarizing what you've already said. And you can see how the conclusion mirrors the introduction. It's got a summarizing statement for everything that you've already written. And it's also got the key contention written as this final concluding statement. And the key thing that I also want to point out is that this is not anything profound. There's a lot of tendency out there to write and conclude the sentence with something profound in some particular saying. You don't need that. All you need are good ideas. You don't need to have any particular idioms or sayings. Just make sure you have a strong structure, good ideas in terms of development, progression, and nuance. And that's all you really need. So as a whole, in terms of everything that we've spoken about today, much of the strengths of this particular essay is the structure. Everything is consistent. Everything relates to one another. Every body paragraph correlates to something that we spoke about in the introduction. Everything in the conclusion correlates to something that we spoke about in the overall essay. Everything within the body paragraphs adheres to the signposted argument. We have not talked about anything else outside of the body paragraphs. And within the content itself, the response engages with the stimuli. There's a very clear starting and direct response to one of the prompts. And all of the key messages and points are elaborated with supporting examples. Every paragraph has an example. Now, the main weaknesses, I suppose, altogether is excessive wordiness, where we could definitely shorten our sentences and eliminate some words. But otherwise, the word choice in terms of the actual words that we choose is fine. So, features of a high scoring essay. Essentially, the key things that I want to impart in you is try to achieve a nuanced contention or thesis that goes beyond just agreeing and disagreeing with the essay prompts. We talked about this before and what it means in depth in the introduction. And throughout the whole essay, I hope you've seen that structure, a particular structure that signposts forthcoming exploration of ideas and then adheres to them, is strong in presenting this essay that is well thought out and planned ahead of time. And so in that relation, planning is incredibly useful. Ideas which are well-reasoned and explored with substance and specificity, referring to this idea that every supporting argument in the body paragraph is developed along a unilateral linear path where we're not incorporating any deviations or going off track. We're adding detail and substance with every single sentence, exploring outcomes, exploring consequences. And that's what we mean by substance and specificity. We're going beyond just the body paragraph, topic sentence. So have a look at your body paragraphs. See and ask yourself whether or not you're actually adding any more detail to what you've already introduced in the topic sentence. Precise and effective use of language. So once again, prioritizing clarity in the word choices as opposed to words that might sound a bit more flamboyant or complex or sound interesting.
If you found this video interesting, then you'll find the skills-based program useful. In the skills-based program, you'll find structured lessons, each targeting an essential section 2 essay writing skill. Each lesson is supplemented with video walkthroughs and examples, and students will have the opportunity to apply their learning through essay submissions. Each lesson will also provide a range of practice prompts and sample essay responses. Check out the link for further information and other free resources on my website. Otherwise, if you have any other questions, feel free to message me via email.